Hello everybody, I'm Nick. In this video I'm going to demystify the scope dependency injection lifetime in .NET and explain how it's not just limited on API requests, but you can actually use it anywhere you want in the way you want it. For example, message processing, background services, and so on. It's one of the most useful things in .NET dependency injection because everyone understands transient and singleton, but there's a very nice healthy medium with scope that you definitely need to know how to use in any use case. So let me show you what I have here. I have a simple API here that it's actually borrowing a lot of the code from the previous channels demo I made, which showcases how you can use channels to create a background processor, for example, like this one, where you can have this send endpoint over here. We push a message into the channel, we get the response immediately back, but then in the meantime, the background processor is doing some processing after 3 seconds. So that's very basic stuff. But something interesting about this channel is that this channel in this case is singleton. And it is singleton because it sort of needs to be singleton. We need to have a maintained channel, and because the hosted service, if I go in here, you'll see is a singleton as well, because that's what add hosted service is doing behind the scenes. It makes sense to have this sort of registration here. However, let me show you this endpoint over here. This endpoint is called ID, and it has an ID generator and an ID printer. These are just two very simple classes I made. One just gets an ID after it's setting it based on its default value. The other one is injecting the ID generator in it, and then it returns that ID. So what I want to show you first, just to demystify everything, is how this would work if first we register these services as transient. So the ID generator, the one that is being injected, is transient, and then the ID printer is also transient. And then I'm printing these two using the ID printer.getID method and then this ID generator method. So I'm just going to run this API very quick, and then I'm going to go to Insomnia and call this endpoint. And as you see, every time I call it, these two endpoints are different. This is because this ID generator will be instantiated once to be injected here, but also once again from scratch to be used here because it is transient. However, if I changed just the ID generator as scoped over here and I run this API again, what you're going to see is that the IDs will now match on a per request basis because the same instance of that ID generator will be passed both on the endpoint and on the dependency here on the ID printer. And because this is just set in initialization, you will reuse the same ID. And that works in .NET by default because API handling is in a scope of its own by default in .NET. You don't have to define anything explicitly. So this all works. However, if I go in here in this processor, any services I inject here that are captured in this method will stay on that lifetime sort of forever. So even if I inject a transient service here, and if I could, because this is singleton and this is transient, so we're going to have a bit of a trouble catching that singleton. But even if I did, you would basically capture a transient or a scoped service forever in here. Now, before I move on, I'd like to let you know that it's DomeTrain's second birthday and we're celebrating with our biggest sale yet. Yes, bigger than Black Friday too. Until the 1st of May, you can use discount code birthday2 at checkout for any of our 85 courses, any of our already discounted bundles, as well as DomeTrain Pro and workshops where me and other authors teach you live a certain topic. We keep releasing courses. We have 5 courses released in the past month, including TypeScript, sending emails in .NET, as well as using AI and LLMs in your programming workflow to be more efficient and more productive. So you don't want to miss this sale. Link in the description. Now back to the video. Now, given that this is now registered as scoped, if I go to the processor and I say private read-only ID generator and I try to inject it, and then every time I print something like the message, I also say print an ID, so console.writeLine and pass down the ID, and I run that and I call that send endpoint, which I have to remind myself how to call. It's just a send call. Well, this API will not start because I'm injecting an ID generator, as you can see, from a singleton while this ID generator is scoped. So we're capturing, so it's not going to allow us to even do that. So we cannot create a scope and we can't inject services into singleton. How can I then do background processing in a custom scope? Well, you actually can. Instead of injecting the ID generator, what you can do instead is you can inject the private read-only iService scope factory. And if I inject that, then what I can do per iteration of the processing at the very top is say using, and the using is important, I will explain why later, by using a service scope over here, I'm going to say service scope factory.create scope or create async scope, whichever one you need. And now if I want to get that service, and actually I'm going to remove the automatic using declaration because I want to show you something explicitly and then put it back in. If I do this, now everything in here on a per iteration processing is in its own scope. So if I wanted to get the ID generator out of there, all I'd have to say is service scope.serviceprovider.get required service and then ID generator. And now this service will be resolved per iteration, and it will be within the scope of anything in here. So if this service has dependencies, for example, if I was to get the ID printer instead of the generator, and I say ID printer, and in the end I said get ID, and just for the sake of this, let's just also get the ID generator and print that too. Then if I duplicate this code and I have the ID, but also the ID from the generator, then what you'll see, assuming both services are scoped, and they don't have to be, I can just leave it like this and it's still gonna work because the ID generator is scoped. But if I just leave this like this and this service starts, and then I go on the send endpoint and I call it, what you'll see in the background once this message is processed is hello from this, and then the same ID. And this all works. I have no resolution issues. That's because now we are in a scope, a custom scope. So imagine you're using that type of looping to get a message out of some service like Azure Service Bus or RabbitMQ or AWS SQS SNS and all that. You can create your own scope and even change it to the using declaration. And as long as you dispose it in the end to say where the scope ends, you can resolve using the service scope factory any service you want in the appropriate scope, and any dependencies that this service might have will also be resolved on that scope. It's ultimately how scoping works on normal API requests, and now with this, you can use it everywhere. There used to be other hacky ways to do it in the past, but this is the one you should be using. Simply inject the factory and then go down and extract everything you want after you create a scope. I generally, in cases like this, always use the long form of writing my scope, mainly because I think it's making it way more explicit in terms of where the scope starts and where the scope ends. But if you're not a fan of the nesting that comes with it, you can always remove it. I'm gonna leave it here because that's how I like it. But if you are doing scoped things like this is what you should be using. It's a lifesaver for most scenarios and can actually save a lot of memory by reducing how many initializations of these types of services you are making. Because the alternative would be make everything transient and then recreate everything, or make a factory, register the factory as a singleton, and then get the service out of the factory. So this is perfect. That's how you should be doing it. There's other ways as well where you can make a base class sort of scoped background service, and then you inherit from that to do your processing. So all this logic can be encapsulated in that. That's another way to do it. But in my opinion, even the basic of this is perfectly fine and highly recommended for everyone. But what do you think? And are you doing something like this in a different way? Leave a comment down below and let me know. Well, that's all I had for you for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, keep coding.